Political conversations. They're the worst, right? Because it seems like no matter how hard we try, they never go the way that we intend for them to go. We go into it thinking, I'm going to stay calm, I'm going to listen. But the conversations rarely ever go that way. Because what happens typically is if one person throws out a fact from a credible source of theirs, and the other person refutes their fact with a fact from a more credible source, and both sides end up just getting frustrated and they leave the conversation having gained nothing. Having productive political conversations is something I struggle with, and it's something that I've been working on for a long time. It's something I want to get better at because I feel like I'm surrounded by people who have opposing political views from me a lot of the time. Every office I worked in when I was a CPA, most of the people there, if not all of the people there, had opposing views to me. And in the last office I worked in, they were very vocal about it. So, and then even at home, my husband, my mom, my best friend all have some opposing views to me. And these are some of the most important people in my life. So it is important for me to have a productive conversation with them, and I really do want to understand where they're coming from. So I've been working on trying to improve the mindset that I take into political conversations for a long time. And I've made some progress, but I'm nowhere near where I would like to be. And I imagine a lot of people are in the same boat as I am. So that's why we're talking about this today. Because we do have a hard time shifting our mindsets. So I've come up with 3 ideas that I think will help us do that will help us improve our political conversations. And also, since those are going to take some time, they're going to take some practice, it's going to take a while for us to see those come to fruition. I also put together 3 suggestions for engaging in productive political conversations that you can implement immediately. So we'll get to all that, but before we get into those, I'd like to first talk about what we do in political conversations that doesn't work, the way most of us approach these types of conversations, because I think that's important to understand. So, as I mentioned, we state facts, and it seems like this would work, right? Because facts are the best way to persuade people, of course, and how can you argue with facts? But we all know that launching facts back and forth doesn't work, because I'm sure we've all tried that. It doesn't lead to a productive conversation, and it doesn't persuade anyone who is already opposed to whatever it is you are saying or whatever it is you believe. But why is that? Because it doesn't really make sense on the surface. So I discovered the answer in a TED Talk that featured Jonathan Haidt, and he is a social psychologist. And his main areas of study are, let me look at this a minute, the psychology of morality and moral emotions. So Dr. Haidt contends that when it comes to issues of morality, intuition comes first and strategic reasoning comes second. Excuse me a minute here. So in other words, our moral judgments tend to be based on emotions and gut feelings and not necessarily reason and evidence. And if you think about it, our personal views are typically rooted in our own personal morals. So that's why you can't sway someone's political opinion or their political views with facts. So stop trying, okay? I'm telling you that. I'm telling myself that. Just stop trying. But what can we do instead? That's the next question. So mindset shift number 1 is learn to focus on your commonalities. So first thing, we just need to remind ourselves as we go into these conversations that most people are not at the extreme left or the extreme right. And actually, in a 2018-2019 study that was conducted by a research group called More in Common, they found that only 14% of the population is on the far left or the far right. And then there's another small group of people who are close to the far right, so they kind of factored those people into the far right almost. But that left 67% of the population who is in what they call the exhausted majority. So that's where most of us are going to fall. Meaning that unless you are on one of the far ends of the spectrum, you share commonalities with 2 out of 3 people that you talk to. Now, I understand that's a bit of an oversimplification, especially since sociologists are also finding, the statisticians, whoever, are finding that people are tending to live closer to people who have the same political views as them. So people with political views are kind of congregating together as far as where they live. So it is harder, actually, um, to find people. It may be harder to find people who have your same political views if you live in a community dominated by opposing views. Okay, if that makes any sense. So I don't know if that made any sense or not, but the point is, you're not outnumbered, even though you may feel like you are outnumbered. And that may not be too encouraging, but try to keep that in the back of your mind. And also remember that people who have opposing political views typically want the same things. The only difference is they have a different opinion on what the best way to achieve those things is. So I've outlined a few things that I think most people want. And number one is safety. So, and safety kind of comes into play in all of these, but people want personal safety. They want safety for their family, their friends, their neighbors, whoever. People also want financial security, which is a kind of security, or a kind of safety, I mean. They also want freedom to make their own choices, and we also want people to be held accountable to some type of moral standard. Okay, so I think we all want those things. We just go about getting to them in different ways. So if we remember that when we go into a conversation with someone, knowing that the person that we are engaging with probably wants these things, I think we'll have a more productive conversation. And because what it does is it changes our expectation from this person is going to attack me, I better be ready for it, to this person might actually want the same things that I do. I'm going to take the time, I'm going to try to ask good questions so I can figure out what we have in common. So this is going to take some practice. As I said, you're not going to be good at it at first. I'm not good at it yet. But we can practice it. We can get there by embracing the cycle of deliberate thinking. And if you don't remember what this cycle is, check it out on the website. There's a link to it on the homepage. And there's a link to it in pretty much every article or every post. So that's mindset shift number one. The number two is to stay curious by remaining skeptical of the media. So in this section, what I mean by this point is we need to realize that the media is part of the cause of our division. We're all being manipulated by the media, whether you're on the left or the right. And I think we all know this, but it's just not something that we give much thought to most of the time. And what really changed my perspective on this was a documentary that I saw about the mass media. And it was a documentary featuring Noam Chomsky, and it focused on his life's work, but it was the central theme of the documentary was based on his book. Well, it's a book that he co-wrote, and that was called Manufacturing Consent. If you're not familiar with Noam Chomsky, he's brilliant. He's one of my favorite thought leaders, but he's a linguist, is how he started out at MIT. He is a philosopher, a cognitive scientist, a historian, a social critic, a political activist. I mean, if you look at Wikipedia or wherever to find out what he does, it would just go on and on and on. He's a brilliant person, whether you agree with what he has to say or not. You can't refute that he's brilliant. And his words that I watched in this video really hit me. And one thing I'm going to read here. One thing he said is, the major media are major corporations. Like any other business, they have a product and a market. And their product is the audience, or us, and their market is advertisers. So they're trying to sell our attention to advertisers. The media is, the news corporations or whoever, because that's how they make money, is from their advertisers. So they're trying to sell our attention to advertisers. And it seems so obvious once you know that, or once you hear that, and that's pretty powerful to know. But it's just not something that we think about, like I said. Another thing that he said, that I'd like to quote here, is he said about the media or news corporations, they're major corporations selling relatively privileged audiences to other businesses. So, pretty powerful, concise statement there. And it really hits home then that, of course, the media is just telling us what we want to hear. Whoever their audience, whoever the news broadcast that you're watching, the news channel that you're watching, whoever their audience is, they're going to tell their audience what their audience wants to hear so that they can sell advertising. So they all do it to varying degrees. And I'm not saying that everything they say is wrong and there's no factual content in the news, but what I am saying is that you need to be skeptical of what you're hearing. You need to corroborate the stories that you hear and go to more than one source. And you need to question statements that just don't make sense to you, because if they don't, there's a reason that they don't make sense to you. And I think this awareness will improve our political conversations, because once you realize that the media is part of what is dividing us, you can go into the conversation realizing that the other person might not be as aware of this as you are, and so they're not intentionally trying to be that opposed to you. It's just kind of been conditioned in their brains from what they've been watching and hearing. And realize that it's not your job to make them aware of that they're being manipulated by the media or whatever you want to say. It's not your job to make them aware of it. That's not going to work either. It's just your job to remain aware of this, remain aware of the fact that you also are being manipulated, so that you can shift your mindset back to finding the commonalities between the two of you. That's, again, we're going back to mindset shift number 1, but that's kind of the point, is to always come back to the commonalities. Alright, so mindset shift number 3 is to sincerely try to understand other points of view. And that's a very tough one to do. But there's another thought leader who I respect very much, and that's Jordan Peterson. And I've talked about him before. He is a professor of psychology, a clinical psychologist, again, a brilliant man. He wrote a book called 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. And one of his rules, I want to read it here so I say it correctly, is assume the person you are listening to knows something you don't. Well, duh, right? I mean, it's kind of obvious that, yeah, you should go into a conversation that way, but how many of us actually go into a conversation thinking that, with that assumption? Well, unfortunately, I can tell you, for me, it's not often enough. So I imagine for you, it's not often enough either. What we do is we often go in trying to prove a point or trying to look brilliant somehow. And we don't go in necessarily with a sincere desire to learn or to understand the other person's point of view. So that's going to be our challenge. Another way that we can shift our mindset is to try to go into conversations sincerely trying to understand their point of view, assuming the person that you are listening to knows something that you don't, and listen more than you speak. Ask good questions and find out where that person is coming from. And again, I think this is going to lead you back to finding more commonalities between each other than you would have found out otherwise. And you might just be surprised how many commonalities you actually have. So those are the 3 mindset shifts. Again, they're all going to take time. They're all going to take practice. So what do we do in the meantime? Because these political conversations are going to keep coming up, especially right now. The impeachment process against Donald Trump is going on. The 2020 election is coming up. So these conversations are going to keep happening. Well, first I put a worksheet together for you, of course, that will help you work through this mindset shift. So go ahead and take advantage of that. But I also have a few suggestions that you can implement immediately for engaging in productive political conversations. So the first one is to take a deep breath and just hold your breath. Count to 10 or whatever you need to do. And then once you're in the conversation, hold your tongue if you have nothing productive to say. And that is very, very hard to do. But in the long run, it's going to be worth it, because it doesn't do any good to say anything anyways if you're not in the right frame of mind. That's number 1. Number 2 is to focus on finding one thing that you agree with that this other person is saying. What's one thing that you agree with them on? Number 3 is to build on that one thing. Just keep coming back to that and try to build the conversation around that, because that's your commonality that you found. And if you truly cannot find anything that you agree with, just be quiet, just leave the conversation, whatever, because again, at this point, it's just not going to be worth your time and energy to engage in that conversation. And remind yourself. So those are the 3 things, but on top of that, I'm giving you a couple more, so maybe there's really more than 3 things. Remind yourself that you aren't going to sway other people's political opinions with reasons or evidence. So stop trying. And you in quotes, are not your political views. So keep that in mind. So someone that has political views that are opposed to yours is not against you, because you are not your political views. So try to remember that. That's only a small part of your identity. And until next time, stay curious.